Hi everyone, so I'll be talking to you today about patients' experiences of assessment and detention under mental health legislation. So we aim to synthesize any qualitative evidence that was out there of patients' experiences, of being formally assessed for admission and then the subsequent experience of being detained under mental health legislation. We wanted to get a better understanding of how people experienced the process, what they didn't like, what they did like, and whether we could use that to try and figure out ways to improve those experiences. Negative experiences are often reported, so it's particularly important to understand the experience of those who have been admitted to hospital without their consent. So how we did this was we searched a number of electronic databases and we did some hand searches as well to try and find as many papers as we could that looked at the particular experience of being formally assessed for involuntary admission and or being detained in hospital for those who were over the age of 18 and when data was collected using individual interviews and or focus groups. As you can see, it does say carers in brackets because our initial aim was to synthesize the evidence of both patients and carers, but because of the number of studies that we actually identified, we decided to split them into two separate reviews, and I'll be talking to you about just patients. We excluded papers that looked at a community setting and not a hospital setting, and when it wasn't clear which one they were looking at. Any papers that included those under the age of 18, and any that collected data using surveys, questionnaires, or case reports. We analysed the data using thematic synthesis, and we also had extensive discussions with our lived experience working group. So the results, what did we find? We ended up identifying 56 papers that looked at that met our inclusion criteria. 50 of those focused solely on the experience of patients, and 6 of those focused on both patients and carers, but we only included the experience of patients in our analysis. The majority of these studies came from the UK, including England and Scotland. We had some from Sweden, Australia, Ireland, Norway, and then a study each from Austria, Finland, Greece, Israel, and the USA. So there was a great variety of where the studies were conducted. Only 17 of these papers actually reported ethnicity, and the reason for that tended to be because of confidentiality reasons and just in case it increased the risk of people being identified. Most of the papers actually reported on the experience of detention in hospital. Some reported on both admission and detention, and 7 papers reported on the experience of admission only, and that mainly included police involvement. 7 focused specifically on a coercive intervention such as seclusion or restraint, and 15 reported from the experiences of patients in a forensic setting. So we identified 5 themes overall. These were information and involvement in care, quality of the environment, quality of relationships, impact on self-worth, and emotional impact. I'll talk you through each of those individually. So information and involvement in care was a big influence on how people experienced admission and detention. These were some of the things that patients actually wanted to know, so how long they'd be detained for, why they're being detained, how they access legal information about rights and entitlements, side effects of medication, and for instance, if they were being restrained or secluded, why that was happening. Some patients did actually receive this type of information, and when they did, it seemed to reduce fear and the impact of coercion. It improved relationships with staff, and patients felt less disempowered. It was particularly important to improve that relationship with staff because that actually facilitated involvement in care and receiving information as well. Carers' input into decisions was also important, particularly when patients were too distressed to engage, but that could also lead to patients being excluded from the decision-making process. And it was suggested that involvement should increase as patients started to get better as well. Treatment during detention mainly comprised of medication, and the need for psychosocial therapies was actually mentioned by a lot of patients. Medication, particularly medication when it was forced, so administered without the permission of patients, was particularly distressing for patients. Side effects were hard to tolerate, and it could be a barrier to taking part in therapeutic activities. However, those in forensic patients actually said that they quite liked being given medication because it reduced their symptoms and facilitated taking part in therapeutic activities. Some patients also said that they actually quite valued the sedative effects of medication, particularly if they didn't feel drowsy afterwards. Information was really, really important during those coercive interventions, specifically restraint. And when information was given, it seemed to reduce distress. Quality of the environment, the physical environment was particularly important throughout the whole care pathway. So those who were initially detained in police cells described them as cold, noisy and distressing. Police cells were actually criticised as a use of a place of safety, and some people felt like they were being punished for having a mental illness when they were held in police cells. Some patients did actually praise police officers for the role they played in ensuring their safety. In hospital, the physical environment was described as minimally decorated, untherapeutic, and a few even compared it to prison cells. They were noisy, overcrowded, and unclean, and that could actually prevent involvement in care as well. But some did actually praise staff for making the effort to try and make wards more comfortable. Safety was particularly important as well. Female patients reported being sexually harassed by male patients, and they found it particularly risky being in communal environments which were shared between male and female patients. There were fears of theft, physical violence and bullying from other patients as well, which made it particularly unsafe as well for lots of patients. And a lack of familiarity with the physical environment of the ward and the people in it also fostered feelings of insecurity. Staff, particularly relationships with staff, they were really, really important in helping patients to feel more secure and safe on wards. Quality of relationships with staff were really, really important, and it helped to reduce distress and to facilitate involvement in care. Staff that were kind and respectful were really, really praised. However, some staff were also seen to be perceived as bullying or disrespectful, especially when they didn't make time for patients. And overcrowded wards and differential treatment from staff negatively affected relationships with other patients, although other patients were actually a source of encouragement and support as well. Impact on self-worth. There were lots of reduced feelings of self-worth and self-respect reported across many studies. Disempowerment was reported in almost every single study, and particularly when coercive interventions were delivered as well. Lots of patients also spoke about the marginalisation and shame that they felt because of being detained, and they were worried about the impact of police arriving at their place, at their home. Emotional impact, lots of positive and neutral emotions like appreciation and acceptance, but also lots of negative emotions such as fear and distress. Sorry, I just feel like I've rushed through everything. Involuntary inhibition was believed to be necessary, but there were lots of negative experiences as well. Information provision, involvement in care, and feeling supported and cared for by staff were particularly important in how patients actually experienced their detention. Physical interventions were particularly negative, and there was the lasting impact of detention as well. Future research should focus on the experiences of minorities, which is one of the gaps that we identified in research. The experiences of assessment was almost, we just didn't find anything that was looking at specifically assessment, and there are some potential foci for interventions. The lived experience commentary from our lived experience working group included there's a recognised need to improve experiences for many years, but it seems there haven't been that many improvements made, and service providers should work towards improving patient experiences, and standards set by independent regulators must be increased.
Thank you. Will you save your questions until after the next presentation? Thank you very much. Perhaps just to clarify, when you said that people thought it was necessary, that was something that some people said,
Yes,
wasn't it?
yeah, for
as
keeping them
opposed to
safe, yeah.
general perception of the... Okay, so Ruth Stewart has similarly worked on a heroically large qualitative meta-synthesis of bringing together of lots of qualitative studies, and she's a research worker with the Policy Research Unit at King's. Thank you.
Thank you. Three of my co-authors, Saida Akhtar, Karen Machen and Karen Persaud, all experienced carers. The title there, Experience of Involuntary Admission under Mental Health Legislation. For brevity, we just keep calling it detention. Karen wrote a separate lived experience commentary that goes with the paper. That's the disclaimer to say these are the views of the authors, not the government.
That disclaimer applies the whole day, by the way.
As Saida explained, the Independent Review of the Mental Health Act commissioned a single systematic review of carers and service users' experience of detention. But when we made the selection of the studies, it was quite clear that the experiences were different and it would be better to present carers and service users' experience separately. We didn't find any previous review of carer experience. We had 6 inclusion criteria. We were looking for qualitative studies published in journals, studies that interviewed carers individually or in focus groups. And as Saida explained, because our original search was for service users and carers, we had an age limit of 18 plus for the service users, but we didn't set an age limit for carers. Carers is the word that we're using as we write up the review, but our search terms were broader. We looked for relatives, friends, caregivers, family. We were looking for studies with experience of assessment and experience of detention in hospital, including appeals and tribunals. We searched in 5 databases and they gave results in English and other languages, but it turned out that no paper in another language fitted our research question. And our method of analysis was metasynthesis. So 23 studies met our criteria. Although we were searching from 1983, all the care studies we identified were done in the last 20 years, and 10 of those were published in the last 3 years. The combined total of care participants in those 23 studies was over 260. In their lived experience commentary, Karen and Karen remind us that carers are not a homogeneous group. But actually, in our review, a typical carer was a white female relative. Only 6 studies reported ethnicity, and 4 of those, all the participants, were white. The Black, Hispanic, and Asian carers were in just 2 of the studies. Most studies reported the sex of the carer, and 70% of them were female. Most studies identified the relationship between the patient and carer, and almost everyone was a relative. As you can see, our studies don't cover the whole world. 2 of the UK studies did not specify exactly where in the UK they were set. The primary studies each analysed different aspects of care experience. For example, this study from New South Wales was about service user and care experience of involuntary transport, and a study from Northern Ireland was about stakeholders' views on legal advice for people admitted to psychiatric hospital. However, I think if we brought all the 260 carers together, they would have a lot in common because the vocabulary they used and the situations they described were strikingly consistent. And the studies we were looking at were rich with quotes from the carers. But we felt I had no right to re-quote them, I'm afraid, because the carers didn't give me consent when they were consenting to be in the studies. We synthesised these 5 overarching themes, which I'll cover in the next 5 slides. Involuntary admission is a crunch point for carers as well as patients, and distress was the emotion carers most frequently reported. Many carers were already angry and frustrated by protracted difficulties in obtaining help for the patient. Although carers accepted the necessity of detention, detention was described as a traumatic process of extreme stress. Carers felt conflicted about giving consent, desperate for treatment, but fearful about what that might mean for the patient and how the patient might react. Guilt, grief, and sadness arose from feelings of failure to prevent detention, and in some cases new information, such as a diagnosis and its long-term implications.
3 minutes.
From the many relevant passages, I chose this author quote because it links to carers' own health. Our German authors too wrote about carers losing emotional strength over successive detentions. A lack of adequate support for carers was a prominent theme across all papers. Prior to detention, carers struggled to know where to turn for help, especially if it was a patient's first episode. Carers spoke about being expected to manage risks and situations such as self-harm, for which they were ill-equipped. They wanted help much earlier, before things reached crisis point. During the period of detention, although carers' overwhelming sense of responsibility was partially relieved, their concern for the patient did not diminish, yet many carers reported being excluded by hospital staff. Visiting hospital is difficult for carers with multiple responsibilities, other children, other family members with disability, or their own health problems. There were few reports in our review about carers' experience of patient assessment. It appears that carers stand back as the professionals take over. However, the extent to which carers felt involved during detention was a key influence on their experience. Carers spoke frequently about needing accessible information, including in writing, as information is hard to process at times of chaos and stress. After admission, carers identified patient confidentiality as a major barrier to accessing information. Carers are baffled and offended that their knowledge of the patient is not sought by staff. They would like to be able to provide information without the patient being told.
1 minute.
Carers are acutely aware that their involvement in detention risks the loss of trust and breakdown of their relationship with their relative. There are examples of patients who refused contact while detained or never spoke to their carer again. While the patient is in hospital, reduction in contact makes it difficult for families to demonstrate their support and love. One of the authors, Henderson, writes of couples having to renegotiate their relationship following discharge because of a carer's role in initiating detention. Many carers describe being treated as strangers by staff, and that staff did not acknowledge the impact detention might be having on the family. In the one young carer study we reviewed, a Norwegian study, young next of kin said that no one, neither family nor staff, ever talked to them about the involuntary admission they had witnessed.
Okay.
Oh dear.
To finish.
Many carers felt let down by services that failed to recognise the severity of the patient's illness and did not intervene until detention became inevitable. There were criticisms of social workers, GPs, A&E, delays in transport, police involvement, and inappropriate places of safety. Quality of care in hospitals seem ultimately to define their feelings about detention. Some carers regretted it after being disappointed by an apparent lack of treatment and meaningful recovery.
Okay. Do you have a summary slide?
Yes, I would just like to say carers greatly appreciated good practice, and then these are obvious gaps in the research.
Great.
And our lived experience commentary had several points, but these two. Thank you. I'm sorry.
So both these papers should be published soon, shouldn't they? So you can look at the more detail. Okay, time for a small number of questions or comments or particularly suggestions for where to go from here. Honestly, I find the lack of any studies looking at people from minority ethnic backgrounds and their experiences quite remarkable, actually, among the various gaps. Any questions?
Got microphones as well now.
Petros and then David, yeah.
It's not very difficult to imagine. My name is Petros Lekos, I'm an adult psychiatrist. It's not very difficult to imagine that our current process of assessing people under the mental health act needs improvement. I'm wondering if there's any idea how, what, or have there been any suggestions what we can do?
So, any ways, any suggestions about how we could improve the assessment process?
Well, we actually didn't find much on the actual assessment.
Yeah.
So when we looked at admission, it was mainly police involvement. So when police came to people's home and some people were talking about being in police vehicles, things like that. And that's actually one of the gaps we recognise about assessment. But I would say information and involvement in care were actually really, really important for helping to make patients less distressed. Because these people, I mean, people didn't know what was happening. And that made them really, really scared, especially at a time when they're really, really vulnerable as well. Having someone there who was quite caring and respectful and also gave them lots of information, whether or not they were processing it or not, that actually really, really helped to reduce the stress.
And yourself?
Yeah, I'm Ben. Just picking up a couple of things that I've seen people tweeting about, so bring that into the conversation. Something that was brought up was about the disparity between clinicians' views of a patient's symptoms or quote symptoms or their insight or quote lack of insight and so on. So the first question is, is there research and could there be research, or there should be research on where that, where those disparities are and how they reflect themselves. Another question would be, about patients' experiences of being formally detained as opposed to being, quote, a voluntary patient, and as we all know, that's very rarely really voluntary. And I wonder if there's any research into the conscious agency of patients. I know as a patient myself, when I'm interacting with healthcare, including mental health, I'm not simply passively experiencing it. I'm after a particular outcome. And when mentally unwell and severely mentally unwell, it's particularly stressful because I'm after the outcome of getting care when I'm ill, but also very keen not to be detained and forcibly medicated. It's a very tightrope. And I wonder if there's any research on how service users engage with that dilemma and how they perhaps game it to,
Actually, we didn't find anything about things that you are talking about. So we actually didn't look at staff perspectives either, so we couldn't make those comparisons either.
The patients ever talk about how their perception of their insight and their experiences are very different to how staff perceive them.
Yeah.
I think it's quite remarkable actually how thin this whole literature actually is. So this is, you're talking about a literature that's been published over the last nearly 40 years around the world, and actually mostly it's about what it's like being an inpatient in hospital, and there's very little of any kind of degree of sophistication about the actual business of finding, you know, the route into being compulsorily detained. It's, yeah. But there is a literature on insight and the extent to which that is agreeing with the clinician, as you suggest. But yeah, that was a bit outside the scope.
Is that sort of like we move forward then?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think these are, yeah, suggestions for what should happen next. Okay, I don't want us to run behind. So for a different perspective, the next speakers are, where are you? There you are. Akiko Hart and Ray Waddingham from the Hearing Voices Network, and they were part of the very quick and impressive production of an alternative perspective on the Mental Health Act review when it came out. So,
in terms of moving the slides forward, is it better for us to be here? Yeah. I'll just use the mouse. Yeah. Great. So, thanks for inviting us to speak on this. This is some thoughts from the alternative review, the Alternative Mental Health Act review that we were co-authors on. Before we introduce it, I guess the thing to say is, I'm a survivor. I'm a current service user of mental health services, and the concerns I have and the things that I want from support are very similar to what was wanted back in 1973. The abolition of compulsory treatments, getting rid of forced medication, wanting not to be discharged against my will when I'm really struggling, just because other people think that I'm fine, wanting the social supports, wanting the access to treatment that I think is going to help me. All of these things were talked about by the Mental Patients Union back in Mental Patients Union back in 1973, and they're still the same things we're talking about now. It feels a bit like Groundhog Day. Just putting that out there. So, who are we?
So my name's
the mental health unit, trade union Unity.
No, it's way before that as well. So it was when the idea that those of us who've been detained under mental health services should have a union like Unison, but it's moved from then. I think.
Yeah, it's kind of dissolved and turned into other organisations. Yeah. So my name's Akiko Hart, and I'm here as a trustee of Hearing Voices Network England. I'm also not a service user, and I haven't been detained, which obviously informs my perspective on this.
I'm Ray Waddingham. I'm chair of HVN and have been detained, which definitely informs my perspective. Although it's worth saying that this report is not our individual perspectives. What we tried to do is actually go, I'm concerned that the overall report is trying to include so many different voices that the survivor voice, the service user voice, can get lost. And I think we need to privilege that, because it's those of us who use services that have our liberty taken away. And so we wanted to redress that balance by holding events, doing a survey, and just listening to our members over the course of the review period. So it's an attempt to bring together some perspectives. It doesn't necessarily go as far as I might on a personal level, but we're a diverse organisation and there's many different views on this. So we're going to go through some of our recommendations and try and give some idea of what research might come from this. Why are we doing this? I think research does not exist in a moral vacuum, does it?
It's political.
It's political. What we choose to research, where the funding goes, the fact that so little has been done on racialised communities, on the views of carers, all of this exists somewhere. And so we want you guys as researchers to really get an idea of some of the critical perspectives out there so you can bring it into your research. So, rights-based approach. This is like the fundamental bit, for me at least. We're inviting a change in services to go from this assumption of risk and how to protect the community and protect the person to follow the United Nations Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disability, which I always say wrong, and actually prioritise human rights. We are left out of the Human Rights Act if we're seen as being detainable. And I think we need to rethink that and have some really deep conversations about all the nuanced, challenging parts of that. we're calling for an end to long-term detention, but recognising that in extreme circumstances, sometimes in our current situation with the lack of services we have and the lack of alternatives, short-term detention is sometimes a last resort. But we don't want to get stuck there. We need to challenge ourselves to really reshape things. We want compassionate, humane and rights-based support when we're in hospital, and to really disentangle this idea of insight and capacity, because I think our current Mental Health Act doesn't really support that. How do we do this in research? It's a bit big, isn't it, really? I think what this says to research is don't accept the assumptions of the people before you. Just as the research into black and minority ethnic communities actually could be carrying on some sort of structural racism, I think the biases of our forefathers is biasing the research now, what's seen as important. So if we step away from that, I think we'll start to look at different things. Oh, any thoughts on you? Or shall I go?
Yeah, no, I think that's about right, because it's about changing our entire perspective. So I'm sure that pretty much everyone here has heard or read stories or testimonies from people who've been detained and who've experienced verbal, physical, emotional or sexual abuse whilst they were detained. And I think in the Independent Mental Health Act Review survey to service users and carers, I think 2/3 of respondents said that they weren't treated with respect or dignity whilst they were detained, and this was very much reflected in our survey as well. So we call for the abuse that takes place on our locked wards to be understood as systemic, as endemic, as institutional. Now, the response to this can sometimes be, well, not all, hashtag not all, yeah? Not all mental health professionals are abusive, and that is absolutely correct. What we're saying when we're saying that something is institutional is that we are talking about the culture of our wards, yeah? The culture of our wards is such at the moment that abuse is tolerated, it is facilitated, we turn a blind eye to it, and that's why it happens. It's not that everyone is abusive, but we allow it to happen. Where do we go from there in terms of research? I mean, I think there's some fundamental questions there about some of the practices that we have at the moment that as professionals we might look at as totally normal, but actually might be experienced as abusive. So for example, restraint would be a really good example of that. I think it's looking at the culture of our wards and thinking what needs to change. You know, it's not just about training, I think, it's potentially about leadership. What is the role of leadership on our locked wards in terms of changing this stuff? For me, I'd really like us to be looking at testimonial injustice. Why is it that people who are deemed mentally ill or mad might not be believed in a complaints procedure, and what kind of impact might this have on practice? Is there anything else you would?
Yeah, sort of even going further than that, so many of us do not complain because we don't think we'll be believed, or we've heard of times when other people haven't been believed, or we're too confused at the time. So it's difficult with the focus on kind of records, because a lot in my records would be written from a staff perspective and miss the huge experiences from my perspective. So for researchers, it's how do you get to the stories underneath? It's also for staff's well-being. My husband's a mental health nurse. He actually didn't go into the wards because he couldn't face restraining people after knowing me. But I know nurses that do this, and there's some great research on the impact of restraints on nurses, and yeah, something about it's part of the job but it spoils the job. If it's making us all so distressed, surely we should come up with alternatives. This has already been spoken about, but it's worth saying to really acknowledge and address institutional racism. There's many good things have been said about this already. The one thing we can probably add is an imperative to engage with the scholarly and personal lived experience literature around schizophrenia as a racist diagnosis. Again, we don't exist in a social vacuum.
Advanced decisions and autonomy. So I suppose one of the big kind of achievements that was heralded around the Mental Health Act review was the recommendation for advanced directives about ECT to be binding. But actually, when you look at it in detail, the recommendation is to make them clinically binding, but they could still be overturned in the court of law. So we call for advanced directives made when capacitors relating to ECT and medication to be entirely binding. You know, on a really simplistic level, I suppose, if I can make advanced decisions about my physical health, and they are binding, why not about my mental health? I actually think there's loads of really, really interesting research being done into this at the moment. So, for example, the Mental Health and Justice Policy Research Group that's led by Gareth Owen is doing great work on this. George is doing some brilliant work on untangling will and preferences and looking critically at the functional test for capacity. Again, going back to this conflation of insight and capacity, which relates to this. So I think there is some really interesting work being done, and actually Insight is actually taking a battering in the courts across the world. So I think that's pretty promising.
I think this also, for me at least, lends to this idea of we know what mental disorder is, it's all really clear, it's all really easy to understand, when actually it's really contentious, like really, really contentious. And it's not an easy area. There's lots of extreme poles, but even in the middle, it's confusing. I'd be really interested in research on clinicians and ideas about, well, why wouldn't we accept someone's advanced directive? So if I went into hospital with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, as I have, and said I do not want any antipsychotics at all, why would that not be upheld? What would the concerns be? Because if we don't engage with those concerns, we're not going to move on.
3 minutes.
We can do that easy. Community treatment orders?
3 minutes, including questions. If you like.
Yeah.
Including questions, we can do this. Yeah, just basically they don't work.
Yeah, there's no evidence that they've reduced detention, so why do we still have them?
Yeah.
Should we do the next one? Because this is the really important one, yeah? Because actually we can get really paralysed sometimes when we think about detention, and we can look at it in terms of like the individual in crisis and, you know, about to harm themselves or someone else, and what do we do? And obviously, like, this is kind of focused to act or to intervene. But what we're missing when we're looking at it through that lens is, what about the days and the weeks and the months that led up to that moment? What was put in place? What kind of support did that individual have? So in these discussions about changing, reforming mental health legislation, they can only happen if they're happening in parallel with how do we improve or transform mental health services.
And this can happen at so many levels before we get to mental health services. Thinking about awareness campaigns at the heart of it that change society's relationship to mental distress. So it's not a them and us, that we're happy that the mental health system deals with the crazy people, but it's actually something together. We could try and deal with the things that make people crazy. Not necessarily cause it for everybody, but definitely impact on our lives. Things like racism, child abuse, sexual violence, transphobia, homophobia, poverty, inequality. The research is there that this affects us. Can we heal society? Building supportive communities has been talked about, and that's key. Creating services that people want to use. Because like crisis teams, I've used them last year, I do not want to use them. It was painful. And I ended up taking medication to stop using them. And it's the only way of getting away.
And it's kind of the basic, isn't it? It's like, what's the point of creating services that people don't want to use? And what do we do about that?
And that might involve specific thinking around particularly marginalised communities. And increasing options in crisis. So in America, there's peer respites. We have one independent non-statutory crisis house in England, and it's not peer-led. So what can we do about changing that? It's not about them being effective, it's about them being an ethically different place to be in crisis. Sanctuaries, having informed choice. And to have informed choice, we actually have to have choice.
That's a good place to end
I
it.
think we're there. Oh yes, no,
Oh, yeah.
3 thoughts. Just
1
some
minute.
1 minute, 3 thoughts. Why is detention and coercion accepted as an inevitable part of mental health care? I think we need to query that. As a modern society, are we still okay with removing people's human rights when they've become overwhelmed? And again, query that. It's complicated, but let's talk about it. And if we answer no, we do want to change what we're doing, what fundamental changes to the mental health system do we need to make that would support this? And as researchers, you guys can be great allies in this. And contact details. Phew.
Could you
on to questions until we've had the next 3 brief presentations, and then hopefully catch up a bit and maybe have some questions after that. So the next 3 questions are back to the research that the Policy Research Unit did last year to inform the review of the Mental Health Act. And these are all focusing on basically the questions about do we know anything worthwhile from current research evidence about what might prevent compulsory admission. So first talk focuses on something that's come up a few times, compulsory treatment orders, and this is work that was led by Phoebe Barnett, who works with Steve Pilling in the PALS department, the Psychology and Language Sciences department at UCL, and she also works with the Policy Research Unit.
First up, I'm really sorry, I'm losing my voice a bit, so I'm sorry if you can't hear me, just wave at me and I'll try and speak up.
There's a microphone if you want it.
Okay. Thank you. So my name is Phoebe Barnett. As Simon said, I've done a systematic review on compulsory community treatment, or sometimes they're called CTOs. I might use that interchangeably a bit, but it's referring to the same thing. So just a bit of background on compulsory community treatment. It's basically making adherence to treatment a legal requirement when you are released from a compulsory inpatient stay. It's used in a number of different countries, as you can see here. And there's quite a lot of controversy around the use of them. A lot of people argue, as has been previously said, that there's not actually much conclusive evidence that they work. And a lot of people also say that they're quite coercive, so we shouldn't really use them. But the arguments for their use are that they aim to reduce the revolving door use of inpatient services. So in that respect, some people say that they're less coercive than other options. So in our review, we looked at a number of different evidence types. We looked at studies that had contemporaneous controls, so that was RCTs, and also observational and non-randomized studies, and also pre-post control studies, or sometimes they're called mirror image studies, and these looked at patients before their CTO and then compared that to after their CTO. We wanted to look at a number of different outcomes. Our main one was readmission to hospital, but we also looked at length of stay and also adherence to treatment and use of community services. It's worth saying here as well that we also wanted to look at things such as suicide and risk of violence, things like that, but it just wasn't really available in the literature, which I think is something that is something to look at in the future. So the results that we found were, so this is for just the pre-post studies. These really did imply that CTOs reduce readmissions for patients. As you can see, there's quite a big effect size. But the problem with these studies is that if you have a patient that's had a lengthy inpatient stay and then they have their CTO afterwards, it's quite hard to know whether that reduction in readmission is because of the inpatient stay, whether it's because of the length of time that's happened. A lot of symptoms are quite cyclical in nature, so it's quite hard to disentangle what is happening there. And that's kind of supported by the evidence of the control comparisons that we saw, where these found no significant difference between patients who were just released informally and those patients on a CTO in reduction in readmissions. Obviously, these studies also have their drawbacks, so RCTs, a lot of people have argued that they don't reflect the severe patients that CTOs are aimed at. A lot of the time, really severe patients are excluded from RCTs, especially, for example, the OGDET trial, which was the UK trial, patients who doctors really felt would benefit from a CTO were excluded, so there was a risk of them being randomised to the non-CTO arm. And then the non-randomised studies, I think a lot of the time, if it's believed that a patient is going to adhere to treatment, they won't be put on a CTO, so they'll be released informally. So the two groups might not necessarily be comparable in that respect. And then this disparity between the two study designs was found also in our other outcomes as well. So you can see here that inpatient bed days, use of community services and treatment adherence, they were all significantly improved in patients on the CTO compared to before the CTO. But when you looked at studies with controls, it was actually only use of community services that were significantly improved compared to controls. The problem with this is that if you only look at RCTs, where you would assume that they would make access to services more comparable between the two conditions, this wasn't significant anymore. So you could argue that in the non-randomised studies, this might have been because patients on a CTO might have been given more access to services to allow them to adhere to their treatment. So in addition to this, we asked Patrick and Karen to give us their opinions on the research. And they kind of said similar things to what we had found, which is there's clear omissions in the data. I think it's been a recurring theme today that ethnicity is poorly reported. We found the same. We wanted to do some sensitivity analysis on ethnicity, but although some papers may have reported the sample ethnicity very vaguely, it was rare that they would report it in a way that meant that you could decipher what patients were finding a benefit from compulsory community treatment and what patients weren't. Same problem with gender. There were very few studies on younger people, like age was not really something that was looked upon. It was very much a clear, this many patients were readmitted, this many patients weren't, and there wasn't any real look at any specific factors. And they also pointed out, which is something that I think has really added to the conclusions that we drew from it, that if access to services in the community was improved, would we need the coercion? So the fact that in some of the non-randomised control studies, patients on the CCT did have improved community service use, that implies that if they're given the option to use it, often they will. So it might be that coercion isn't necessary. So conclusions then, we don't think there's sufficient, consistent and robust evidence to justify compulsory community treatment, especially given the increased costs and the coercive nature that they have. I think more effort should be spent on making access to community services better, and also looking at reasons why patients might not adhere to treatment. And that's been a common argument for why CTO shouldn't be used. And as I said, although there was some evidence for a mechanism of improving treatment provision, this wasn't demonstrated when considering only RCTs, so it might have been that people on CCT were offered more services. Yeah, just to sum up then, we should ensure that there's appropriate community care for everybody regardless of their legal status, and I think that is something for future research to look at.
Thank you very much. So next is Jess Bone, who's a PhD student in the Division of Psychiatry at UCL, and she led a group of our PhD students who conducted quite a huge review while moonlighting for the Policy Research Unit. So thank you, Jess.
Thank you, Sonia. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about a rapid evidence synthesis that we did of psychosocial interventions to reduce compulsory admissions. So I think as we've everything we've discussed today makes it really clear that interventions to reduce compulsory admissions, whether that be mental health service models or general interventions, are really important. And there was a meta-analysis published in 2016 looking at interventions that might reduce compulsory admissions. That was a few years ago. Their search was done in April 2015, and their review maybe wasn't as broad in scope as it could have been. So what we did is a rapid evidence synthesis to update this, looking at any mental health service models and interventions that might reduce compulsory admissions. So, in order to do this, we used the P-course criteria to include trials in the review, and the participants in the trials were anyone with a diagnosis of any mental health disorder, and we didn't limit that by age to keep it as broad as possible. And we included 15 broad types of psychosocial interventions. And these interventions were identified by an expert group of clinicians, service users, policymakers, researchers, and all of those interventions were identified as potentially having an effect on reducing compulsory admissions. So we included all of those in our review. And then we included any randomized controlled trials that compared any of those 15 interventions to any other kind of active treatment or treatment as usual. And our outcome was obviously compulsory admissions. However, that was measured or reported. So in the papers, in the trials, it could have been reported as a primary or secondary outcome or as an adverse event. So we kept it deliberately really broad. As you might have noticed, I called it a rapid evidence synthesis and not a systematic review. So we used a slightly different search strategy to ensure that we could keep it broad, but do it rapidly enough to include it in the Mental Health Act review. So basically, we identified systematic reviews of each of the 15 interventions, and then screened the full text of all articles in those systematic reviews to see if they reported compulsory admissions. And then we also looked at trials that post-dated those reviews, and again screened the full text of all of those trials to look at whether they included compulsory admissions. So we tried to do it as broadly as possible within the time constraints. So this is a bit of a horrible table, but basically what it's showing is that we found 949 trials in total of those 15 intervention types, but of those 949 trials, only 19 reported compulsory admissions in any form. So the interventions in white on here, on the left is the 15 interventions we included. The ones in white had absolutely no trials reporting compulsory admissions. So we couldn't really evaluate their effectiveness in reducing compulsory admissions in this review at all. And the ones in purple are the ones I'm going to talk about in a sec. Just to point out, in the third column, where it says descriptive data, what this is showing is that of the 19 trials we included, 8 of them didn't even actually analyse compulsory admissions as an outcome in the trial, so they just reported descriptive data on how many compulsory admissions occurred. Some of them didn't even report it by study arm, so we had to contact the authors and ask for that data, and then we ran post-hoc analyses ourselves to look at that. So, what did we find? I'm going to talk through the interventions according to their kind of effectiveness on reducing compulsory admissions. So the best evidence we found was for self-management interventions and crisis planning or advance statements. And there was kind of strong evidence that these did reduce compulsory admissions. So briefly, just to say, these interventions are kind of overlapping in their content, and they involve relapse prevention planning. So this includes identifying early warning signs of relapse with a clinician, and then individuals plan and share their personal coping strategies and the support that they desire from clinicians and carers and family members in advance of a relapse. So then moving on, we found kind of mixed evidence for early intervention services. So these services are kind of multidisciplinary community teams, and they are specifically intended to provide care to people following the first episode of psychosis. And they take a relatively intense approach, which focuses on psychological and social recovery. And we found 3 trials of early intervention teams that did report compulsory admissions. 2 of these showed a strong effect in reducing compulsory admissions after receiving care from the early intervention team compared to standard care. The third trial, which was the largest one we included, didn't find a significant reduction in compulsory admissions. But this was a Danish trial in which the rates of compulsory admissions were really low. So we think that non-significant effect might be due to the context. So we think that early intervention services do show some promise, but we need some extra research on that before we can make a definitive conclusion. And then unfortunately, the rest of the interventions that we were able to include in the review didn't show any evidence in reducing compulsory admissions. So for adherence therapy, crisis resolution teams, and assertive community treatment, they didn't find any evidence that receiving the intervention versus receiving standard care reduced the number of participants with compulsory admissions. And then again, for cognitive behavioural therapy for psychosis and crisis houses, it's a very similar story. Although for both of those trials, they were both of those interventions, they were very small trials, and we did perform post-hoc analyses ourselves, which suggested the effects were in the right direction. So there were less compulsory admissions in the intervention group, but I think really the trials were just too small to show any significant differences between the groups, so we can't make any conclusions based on that. So to sum up what I just said, we found 949 trials of those 15 types of intervention. Of those, less than 2% reported compulsory admissions as a primary or secondary outcome or even an adverse event. From those interventions, crisis planning and self-management seem to be the most promising, and that is in line with the previous review that I talked about that was done back in 2016. They only found evidence for crisis planning as well. Although we've kind of added to that and think that early intervention teams may also be an effective intervention. And then just a few implications from that. I think it's quite clear that we should be implementing and improving access to crisis planning and self-management interventions, and probably also EIS teams as well. But before we can talk about any more implications for practice, I think we need a lot more research in this area. So as I've said, a lot of the trials were really too small to make any definitive conclusions about compulsory admissions. So I think it's really important that researchers consider this when they're designing their trials, and that they maybe need to register compulsory admissions as an outcome and base their kind of power calculations for their trials on this pretty rare outcome. Also, when we're screening the papers, a lot of them didn't clearly report compulsory versus voluntary admissions, and therefore, for the purposes of this review, we had to exclude them. So therefore, we think future research should really clearly distinguish between compulsory and voluntary admissions, particularly research that's done in the UK, where it's relatively easy to report compulsory admissions as they're recorded in routine data. So trials should all really be reporting those outcomes. And then we do understand that there's a lot of costs and time associated with running trials, so maybe doing observational studies might be more useful, so using routine data and looking at interventions observationally to see which ones might reduce compulsory admissions. And then just finally, I've taken a few key points from Karen, Sarah, and Karen's lived experience perspective on this paper. So they pointed out there are lots of factors that are likely to be important for how effective all of these interventions are in reducing compulsory admissions, and none of these things have really been evaluated in any of the trials to date. So these include the quality of the implementation and the length of each intervention, also whether it's suitable for each individual's needs given their current circumstances, and as well as that, where in each individual's mental health trajectory they receive that intervention. And again, as we've heard a lot about today, I think individuals' characteristics really need to be considered when we're talking about these interventions. So their ethnicity, their culture, first language and religion, they might all affect people's access of services and also their likelihood of being admitted compulsorily. And then just finally, as we kind of said in our discussion as well, Karen, Sarah and Karen were kind of surprised and quite concerned about the lack of reporting of compulsory admissions in all of the trials of these interventions. And they also recommended that it should be an outcome measure for all relevant research in this area. Yeah. Thank you to the co-authors and PR Youth Fellows.
Okay, thank you. And finally, in this group of presentations, Dr. Emma Molyneux from King's is going to talk about a review focusing in more depth on one of those interventions.
So thanks very much. I feel like if you were concentrating during Jess's presentation, you can actually answer this question already, and I don't really need to say anything. But I'll just go through quickly what we found in this review, which was a systematic review focusing specifically on crisis planning interventions. We've obviously had lots of background as to why this is important today, so I just wanted to focus on what we actually mean by crisis planning interventions. We were using this term quite loosely to refer to interventions which enable people to be involved in planning their care, including in the event of a future mental health crisis. There are obviously multiple different types of crisis planning interventions which exist, and they vary in terminology and in content and in legal enforceability. These include advanced decisions, advanced statements, joint crisis plans, and advanced directives. As just mentioned, there's some previous evidence that crisis planning interventions are effective in reducing compulsory admissions. But this previous paper was looking at any interventions to reduce compulsory admissions, so it didn't identify many details of the crisis planning interventions included, and also didn't examine any important secondary outcomes. So in this review, as well as focusing on compulsory psychiatric admissions, we were really interested in a number of secondary outcomes, including rates of voluntary hospital admissions, overall rates of hospital admissions, so that includes voluntary and compulsory admissions, as well as these other secondary outcomes here, which we thought were very important. They actually were assessed in very few of the studies we identified, so unfortunately I can't really speak about them. And I'm going to focus on compulsory admissions, voluntary admissions, and overall rates of psychiatric admissions. So for our methods, this was a systematic review specifically of RCTs, which examined any form of crisis planning intervention compared with treatment as usual. For this review, we were focused on studies of adults with a diagnosis of psychotic illness or bipolar disorder, or studies which included a mixed sample from secondary mental health care, which included a majority of people with these diagnoses. This decision to limit was made as a sort of feasibility decision because we had quite a short period of time, and also because this is where we know that the majority of the evidence is. However, it's obviously a limitation in this systematic review, and I think potentially if we did it again, we would have done that differently. We had no exclusion criteria based on language or date of publication. Okay, so what did we find? We identified 1,500 studies through our searches, of which 5 studies were eligible. Here's just some key details of these studies here. You can see 3 of them have been conducted in England, 1 in the Netherlands and 1 in Switzerland, and the number included in these trials ranges from 160 people to 569. 3 of them examined joint crisis plans. 1 was looking at advanced statements, and the most recent study was a crisis planning intervention with more intensive monitoring. So, were they effective in reducing compulsory admissions? We already know the answer to this, but here is a meta-analysis pooling the results from these 5 studies. The diamond at the bottom of the graph over there shows the pooled estimate, which suggested a 25% reduction in the risk of compulsory admissions for people who had received a crisis planning intervention compared with people who had received usual care. So that's quite a substantial reduction in the risk of compulsory admissions. And the confidence interval suggested that it's between a risk ratio of 0.61 and 0.93. So it was statistically significant as well, based on these 5 studies. So we also, as I said, thought about voluntary admissions. We only had data on voluntary admission rates from 3 of the papers. You can see here the story is actually quite different. So there was no evidence that crisis planning interventions reduced the rates of voluntary admissions among people who had received them compared with usual care. If anything, there was a trend for voluntary admissions to be slightly more common among people who had received crisis planning interventions compared with people receiving usual care. Finally, we looked at overall admission rates. Again, we have data on this from 3 of the included trials. And as you might expect, this is a picture that's somewhere between what we found for compulsory admissions and what we found for voluntary admissions, because for these trials, they've combined the 2 to look at them here. And again, there was no evidence that crisis planning interventions were significantly reducing the overall risk of admission among people receiving these interventions compared with usual care. So in conclusion, we did find that there appears to be quite a substantial reduction in the risk of compulsory admissions associated with the use of crisis planning interventions. But there was no evidence that crisis planning interventions were reducing the overall risk of psychiatric admissions or of voluntary admissions alone. These 5 studies reported quite substantially, there were strong overlaps between the interventions that they used, but there were also quite a lot of differences, which I haven't had time to go into today, but we explore in more detail in our paper, which hopefully will be published soon. So they had some differences, and they also, a number of them reported difficulties in the implementation of these interventions. So potentially the crisis planning interventions, joint crisis plans, weren't being created through separate meetings, they were being done in the context of usual clinical practice, or the crisis planning forms weren't being completely filled in. So there are a number of problems with implementation within the context of these trials. And if we think about the difference between implementing an intervention in a trial versus in clinical practice, there obviously are substantial problems with the implementation of crisis planning interventions in usual clinical practice as well. I just want to finish by talking a bit about a number of the important points raised in the commentary from Patrick and Rachel, who are part of the Lived Experience Working Group. A really important point here, which has been mentioned in a number of the other talks, is how we think about this difference between compulsory and voluntary admissions. You could say, oh, it's great news that these interventions seem to be reducing the risk of compulsory admissions and maybe making people more confident in voluntary admissions and more likely to accept these, both from the perspective of the patients and the clinicians. However, as Patrick and Rachel highlighted, and people have highlighted already today, voluntary admissions can often be de facto detentions or compulsory admissions, phrased more like you need to come in voluntarily or we will section you. And that's obviously an important thing to think about when interpreting the findings. As I mentioned, our review was limited by its focus on psychosis and bipolar disorder. And again, another theme which has come up a number of times is that very few of the included studies broke down the results by race or ethnicity. One interesting thing which Patrick and Rachel highlighted is that the 3 English studies largely predate austerity, and the most recent one, in fact, found no significant benefit of crisis planning interventions on risk of compulsory admissions. And Patrick and Rachel highlighted that in their experience, compulsory admissions often seem to relate to lack of resources. So that may be another thing we need to think about in generalising findings to the current context. Finally, there were 2 of these included studies had economic evaluations, which suggested a high chance that crisis planning interventions are cost-effective interventions. And the final thing that Patrick and Rachel highlighted was the importance that any economic savings should be invested in better and radical crisis support interventions. Thank you very much.
We have our speakers from this session. We've got about 10 minutes for questions and discussions with Ray and Akiko as well, if that's right. Okay.
Richard Kelly from the Department of Health and Social Care. I've found it interesting, this is perhaps a wider question across the day, that a large number of the studies that we're finding have been UK based. I'm just interested to understand, is that a product of the fact that we do more research here than elsewhere, possible bias in the search terms that are being used, anything that you can say about that? Thanks.
I think research of this kind of nature, actually there is quite a lot of it in the UK. Most of these searches were carried out without language restriction. I think in the States it's very hard to do any kind of research looking at the mental health system just because of the way their services are organised. And I think here, Australia, possibly Scandinavia are important settings for this kind of research. Yeah.
So in our review, the 12 of the 19 papers were from the UK, so yeah, very UK based. And one thing we found with studies from the US is that compulsory admissions aren't routinely reported there separately to voluntary admissions, so that makes it a lot harder for researchers to collect that data. So I think in the US that's a big issue that needs to be solved for research.
I just want to say, as a carer, you can see I'm also an intervention, and I'd like to see more made of the use of carers' experience. I know not everybody has a carer, but my experience is far from unusual. The first 2 times my husband became psychotic and had to be sectioned, it hit me like a bolt out of the blue, and I didn't know what was happening. The 3rd time I said to myself, we've done this before. And that time I was able to negotiate a voluntary admission to hospital rather than being sectioned. And the 4th, 5th and 6th times that it happened, because clinicians actually listened to me, we were able to stop them going into hospital altogether. Now, as I say, my experience is far from unusual, but I don't think enough attention is paid to carers, because when you've looked after somebody who's very ill, mentally ill, for many, many years, you become an expert on that person, and you usually are the first person that knows when that person is becoming ill, and very often we're seen as a nuisance or an inconvenience. So I would like to see more research done and support given to carers.
How did you get them to listen to you after the first 2 times?
Talk to them. You know, it just depends on the clinician. Some of them, I would say the better ones, will listen to you. They realise who you are, what lived experience you've got, what you're bringing to the table, and they will listen to you. Others, you know, just push. Particularly when my husband got ill, and he'd say, very often happens, I'm badly of the piece. This often happens to carers, and then staff on the ward just won't talk to you. They treat you like, I know you've got some terrible illness, and won't talk to you. But people that've got more experience will listen, and they can learn an awful lot from you. It's very true.
Any comments?
I'm just really interested in the. Sorry, yeah, I'm interested very much in the social aspect of that, because my dad managed to stop a Section 3 for me by learning the game. How do you talk to the workers? And that's very much about the experiences he's had in his life as a policeman that have helped him navigate hierarchical systems. If he hadn't had that experience, I'd probably have had many more Section 3s. And so researching that, I think, is important. And yeah, I think carers can be a really amazing resource.
George?
In the joint crisis planning intervention, the patient is accompanied by a relative friend or advocate. In the joint crisis planning intervention, the interview where the plan is devised follows some preliminary work from the facilitator, but there's a carer, relative, friend or advocate who accompanies the service user in the interview with the critical team in devising the plan. And furthermore, the plan will often contain a lot of information like who should be called if I start behaving in a way that indicates I might be becoming ill again, who should not be called and what sort of ways might they help. So there is quite a substantial
When it
number.
happens, it's good, but it doesn't always happen. That's the problem.
Yeah, but it should be part of the children's.
Hi, my name's Lucy from the Mental Health and Justice Project. So I've been emailing a few of them, so it's really great to say hello. I'm spectacularly grateful for this work. We're doing a project on creating a model of advanced decision making for people with mental health problems to work in collaboration with carers and psychiatrists. And obviously we're all really excited to see advanced choice documents coming into the scene, and hopefully the bill will be passed and it will be possible for people with mental illness to make advanced decisions, make advanced statements with the same weight as people making decisions about mental health problems. And I suppose what I'm interested to hear from you is your kind of hopes and dreams for how that might change the current situation. What might be the ultimate, what would be kind of the dream outcome if it were possible to make these kind of collaborative decisions? How would it change current practice?
So true, I can answer it as the section person. It's difficult because there's a difference with me between collaborative decisions and advanced decisions. The advanced decisions I want is to be able to say I don't want to be forcibly hospitalised, which I don't think would ever go into law, and I don't want antipsychotic medication. So the difference, with my happy hat on, it would force as a society and the health and social care services to look more wider at different ways we can be supported. So drug-free wards, crisis, peer crisis support, and a whole range of things, and skill staff up in things more than medication. So if we stepped away from accepting the coercive aspects of mental health care, I think it could change a lot. But there'd be a period of crisis because we're not there yet.
This is it, because I think that for me, advanced decisions, they really trouble some of our fundamental kind of ideas around what is mental mental health, mental disorder, capacity, etc. So yes, I think it's great that it's being tackled in this way, but I do wonder how far it can go, given that we're asking really big questions within this.
I guess from a researcher perspective, it is quite impressive that, I mean, most of these trials, there wasn't actually a change in the law. It was actually just a change in in people's clinical practice. It was doing something that's already legally possible, and, you know, as you've heard from Jess, had a lot more effect than most of the things that have been tried, even something as kind of hefty as CTOs. This was better. So I think one can assume that overall, particularly if it all has a greater legal force, it seems to me it has to have an impact. I don't need to have anything to add. No.
Because advanced statements aren't legally binding, in a situation where we're looking after, I'm a carer, looking after my son, when he goes downhill, he cuts us out. That's the first thing he does. So even if you've written an advanced statement, I want my parents involved, we're normally met by confidentiality. How will that change?
Well, I think the answer is because we've been able to do advanced ages, but they have absolutely no teeth, you can't feel, you can't work, and we put in a prolonged system in which you can do all those things. But the one thing we shied away from, we have not gone to the point of saying they're 100% fine. But the burden of proof shifts massively over to the clinicians to say why they won't implement, as now it's the other way around. But the reason we haven't gone entirely as we said is because what would happen if we made them 100% binding that you could refuse all treatment, we are frightened of getting to what would actually happen would not be people who invest in much better alternatives. You would just be left, as has happened in some parts of Canada and the USA, you would just be left detained indefinitely without treatment, because that would be much easier. And we backed away from the idea that the only way to change is to make things far worse. And I don't think we could sanction. I just don't think we could sign up to that. But what will happen, and you mentioned ECT, there are clinicals, and you said that things are very uncertain in mental health, which they are. And it's precisely because of that, we've always backed away from making anything completely mandatory. We think there would be about 1 or 2 cases a year in which a judge would uphold a reversal of an advanced directive on ECT. It would be no more than that. But there are scenarios where that could happen, where someone loses capacity, is then in an appalling state and is unable to change their mind in something where there's a reason to think that they would want not to suffer in the way they were. And we therefore left as an option, you could go to the High Court. And we think maybe 1 or 2 times that would happen. It would be fairly intolerable, and I think we may not to have that. So that's the answer to the question. We've rebalanced the system, but it has to be the other way now. The default position would be to follow the advanced directive unless there is a very strong argument and you have an appeals system.
I just want to say, I think we've not answered the lady's question.
Well, I have, because
there's a different one, because I think the stuff that we were talking about, I love that you've answered that and I'd love to dialogue with you, but one of the really simple ones, and you can think of it, because it sounded like you were asking, what happens when they cut us out? And I'm wondering about, yeah, they do. Sorry, can I finish this, please? Thank you. Hannah. One of the things I think is really tricky, and I actually agree a lot with what Simon's saying, is you make a decision at one point and then you think something different. How do we know which decision is valid? But I actually think if we think much harder about this nature of advanced decisions and actually discuss people, like last time you didn't want your parents to know and then you did. How are we going to know where you're at with this? Like more dialogue. And so I don't believe in leaving people in the ditches, but I think we need to just think more about it.
One more question before going on. Do you want to ask it? Okay, you're nominated.
Going back to your point, Akiko raised about epistemic injustice, you called it testimony injustice. The Service User and Care Group on the review had a great deal of discussion around this, about the fact that people are not believed simply because they're deemed to have a mental health condition. And especially you highlighted in complaints. And I'm thinking there needs to be a kind of understanding of the cycle people can get into. If they've had an abusive experience, or a difficult experience, or a traumatic experience when they've been detained, if they're then prevented from talking out about it, or if they do, they're disbelieved, that leads to a whole cycle. And I think in terms of repeat detentions, it means that the person feels more disadvantaged in terms of services, and their mental health is likely to have deteriorated. And so that sets up a dynamic which is likely to lead to complications and possibly to further detentions, because the person will be less favourably disposed to the idea of going into hospital. So maybe some work looking at those particular cycles where people get caught up in that system, and what could be done about that. The whole idea of epistemic disregard, and especially in relation to complaints or speaking out against.
That's great. Okay, thank you very much to finally, to round up before we have a well-deserved tea break, I'm very pleased to welcome Dorothy Gould, who's an independent consultant and trainer from lived experience and associated, I think, with NSUN.
Okay, so thank you. Just to say that description fits me really quite well, so thank you for that. I certainly was also considerably involved in the independent review, so as an advisory group member, I was also part of the topic group on reducing detentions, co-facilitator with a leading colleague for two of the BME focus groups, and also at various of the consultation events. What I want to emphasise in this presentation is I'm not speaking just me as an individual. I'm speaking very much on behalf of the National Surviving User Network, which is a user-led network, and a whole range of other user-led groups. I'll also be using the term lived experience through the presentation on the whole. That's because not all of us identify with mental health terminology. When you talk about lived experience, you can kind of put what you want on the end of it, which means you can define yourself. So, talking about some key detention issues for those with lived experience. One is, and I think this has been touched on a lot already, experiences of detention are so often traumatising, just at a time when you're already at crisis point. And for a lot of us, that's also resulted in post-traumatic stress. So, you go in hoping for healing. But for a lot of us, you actually come out feeling more traumatised. I mean, to talk just a little bit about some of my own experiences. When I went in, and I was actually meant to be a voluntary patient, but I was obviously put on section 2, almost the very first message I got was, if you leave, we'll take your clothes away from you, which was hardly a helpful message when I was in a state of acute distress. I have to say, I was very afraid of the ward. I mean, it felt, when I observed some things that are happening to people, for example, if people were refusing medication, the level of coercion that was used, people being held down, which again was sort of very frightening, and the last thing I wanted to feel. I didn't feel at all safe on ward, but I'd actually gone there, because I felt so unsafe. And in terms of healing, I didn't come away healed at all. I wasn't given any useful model help to explore the model or understanding my own distress. For me, mental model actually isn't particularly helpful. Nor was there any talk with me about, kind of ways that would help me to cope. There seems to be such reliance on outdated concepts, and George has drawn this out really well, that if you have a mental health label, you automatically lack capacity and you're automatically dangerous. those are they're stereotypes, and in that sense very discriminatory. In that sense, a bit like Carol was referring to, and has also been referred to by Human Voices Network, we experience epistemic injustice. In other words, if there are myths about you that you're automatically lacking capacity, then your judgments are automatically not going to be regarded as capable. And if you're automatically sort of dangerous, then it's not surprising that many of us find ourselves in a culture in hospitals and in other parts of mental health services which are disproportionately risk-based. And again, I really want to highlight, because I think it is so poorly covered in most research, that if you face additional prejudices because of things like ethnicity or gender or age, sexual orientation, socio-economic circumstances, then you tend to sort of have an even more difficult experience. Just as a... Oh, is the mic on?
We'll change mics if I run out of battery.
Okay, thank you. So I thought a couple of quotes might well illustrate what people's experience are, particularly people who are thought to deviate from social norms, and a lot of us with lived experience are thought to. As you can tell, there's very much changing social norms that go on around culture and ethnicity, so I'll leave you to read it for a minute. So in other words, you see, in one way on the streets of London and another in Tibet. Another quote, this time from someone with a learning disability, a woman with a learning disability, or as people often prefer to call it themselves, a learning difficulty. And again, you'll see she's strongly championing social norms. That for a long time homosexuality was regarded as deviant because it didn't fit social norms. That there's also ongoing struggle for people with learning difficulties because where their behaviour may be different, then it's regarded as sort of not normal or sometimes challenging behaviour arising from very various circs are the reason why someone is then detained. To move on to the Mental Health Act specifically, one of the biggest problems that we've got is that it is founded in discriminatory stereotypes about lack of capacity and the need for preventative detention on the grounds of risk. Another concern is that it's very much based on a Western medical model. What happens to people of other ethnicities who have different models, or people like a number of us who actually don't find the white Western medical model helpful? I've already alluded to the fact that sort of social norms are so often, what determine whether you're punished as sort of, in quotes, normal or abnormal. And for many of us, the authorisation of substitute decision-making, detention and forced treatment do really feel as if they are discrimination and don't allow for the fact that we do have a lot of useful, non-useful skills. Going on with some of the issues for us related to the norm, what we'd really like to see is a progressive realisation of the recommendations from the Committee for the United Nations Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which Ray has already referred to. supported by human rights law instructionists in this country drawing on the Convention. And it's not that that the government hasn't signed up to that convention, it has. There also were recommendations from the Committee for the Convention in 2017, which were very much advocating a human rights model and an end to compulsory PERS. And the convention itself is very important to a lot of us because it's one of the conventions that actually is very much drawn up jointly by people with lived experience, as well as people with disabilities, which is one of the reasons it captures so much of what we want. And it very much emphasises a human rights model, social model, an end to substitute decision-making, detentions and forced treatment, a focus on people who are disadvantaged in more than one way, and also meaningful involvement of user-led organisations in formulation of law, policy and practice, which again is one of our concerns that, because that isn't happening a lot, that's one of the reasons why things aren't going in the way that they should be. A further issue for us is that, although, like I said, the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities has been ratified by the government, it was by the Labour government when it was in power, it's actually the European Convention on Human Rights which has been incorporated into UK law. And for many of us, the rights in that Act are not as good as those in the CRPD. We also were encouraged by the attempt to move forward through the review. I think that there was a huge amount of sort of hard work that went into it. Nothing but admiration for people with experience, who fought, to get what needs to be in it, but also considerable disappointment from user-led groups, National Survivor User Network and a whole range of other user-led groups, because we feel it still falls short of what we would have wanted, and it's like, how long do you have to wait for full human rights? We would have liked, a really imaginative approach which could have looked at some of the issues around reading CRPD in rather more imaginatively, if you like, and much more of that moves towards that in the review. So just to explain some of the points that we feel were disappointing. Although advanced choice doctrines are, I think, a real attempt to move forward, they don't cover the right to refuse detention. We're also concerned that they only apply to people who are assessed as having capacity. A lot of us have found that a very subjective process. And also it feels a bit like a two-tier system. What we would have liked is people who are really going to struggle with the decision to have supported decision-making in the sense that the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities recommends, so that you have a sort of uniform system for everyone. We do very much think that the review rests on assumption of a medical model, hence the sort of practical use of diagnoses and so on. But for quite a lot of us, the medical model isn't a particularly helpful one. And a big concern was, much though we welcome that there is a focus on BD groups, on people with learning difficulties, on children and young people, obviously proof that Britain will be meetings how effective those are, but we're really concerned that there's some groups facing double or more disadvantages who get almost no focus and review. So as a woman, I really would have wanted women's issues to be prominent in the recommendations as well as the material. There's very little, if any, focus on people from lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender communities, or older people with physical disabilities, or sensory impairments. So that is a big concern for us because we felt like that was a sort of lack of equal opportunities in the approach taken. Moving on to some research ideas of taking what I've said into account already. We'd very much like to see research into human rights-based options which are in line with the CLPD for people with lived experience who have reached crisis point. Because at the moment, so often, the main option just is detention. And you can't, even if you looked in a very sweeping way about, we'll get rid of detention, well, you can't just do it in a vacuum. You've got to actually build in other resources for people where people can get support and in a really humane, respectful, person-centred kind of way. The second thing we'd really like to see more research into is supported decision-making of the sort of recommended by CRPD. And there is already one example in Sweden, the personal ombudsman scheme, which actually is compliant. We'd like to see research to that. We'd also like research into user-led alternatives, including alternatives by people with lived experience who do face more than one form of discrimination. And just a little bit also about the kind of research. We would like, in any research that happens, to have good representation of user-led research. For a variety of reasons. One is that user-led studies themselves are a direct challenge to disempowerment. So in other words, if it's agreed that you're leading research, then that's quite an empowering decision to make. If user-led studies are resourced, then it does mean that there's recognition that so far from us lacking credibility, our experiential knowledge has actually got a vital role to play in research if we're going to get the kind of support and help that we really need. And in addition, taking a lead in user-led studies means we can take a lead in exploring what service models and resource options benefit us, instead of being purely service recipients. So for all those reasons, what we would really like to see in future research about detention is good representation of user-led studies.
3 minutes.
Just that does actually, yes, bring me to the sort of very much towards the end. Got my email address there for people who might want to be in contact. And then the final slides are the references I use, including some of studies which have been directly user-led. Thank you.
Time for a couple of questions or observations for Dorothy. Okay, you're all questioned out for the moment. All right, so what's going to happen now? Don't run away, because this is the part of the day coming up where we need you most. Okay, there's tea at the back, so you have that here on the foyer. And then we would like you to go to one of 3 places for some further discussion about your perspectives on what should happen next, particularly in terms of research. Now, where's room 728? Is that miles away?
It's up on the 7th floor.
Okay, if we send the practitioners to room 728, they'll never come back. So the Jeffrey Hall is huge, isn't it? I'm sure we can have
door,
yeah, we can have 2 groups in there, I'm sure. It's fast. Yeah. No?
Well, we have 3 rooms and space
Okay.
for people to talk quietly. You can lead the practitioners kind of up the lift.
All
and
right.
it's only
Are you in charge of the practitioners?
I'm not, but I know Amanda is, and I know who is. Yeah,
all right. So, the 3 groups, but these are, we understand that many of you may have 2 or 3 of these identities, or none of them, whatever, but we invite you to roughly divide, according to what you feel like doing today, into a group of people who have relevant lived experience to meet in here, And is that you, Vicky?
Myself and Natasha.
So with Vicky and Natasha, to discuss your views on research priorities. Then a group of practitioners led by Alan and Claire, excellent, who will maybe gather in the foyer and lead your research, your practitioners. And can I suggest that if you're maybe both a practitioner and a researcher, looking who's here today, it might be a good idea for you to go to the practitioner group with Alan and Claire, and then the researcher group led by Paul and Bryn in the 1,000-seater Jeffrey Hall, which is next door. As I say, I know that that's a rough way of dividing you up. Is that all right? Okay, so go there, have some ideas, and come back at 4 to share your ideas and listen to Viral talk about a policy perspective. Thank you.
Sorry.